it's really hard to ask a big international organization that for decades has been having as their primary missionary base a specific culture, a specific language, to say, well, suddenly now we have a very small representation of another ethnic group, and now you need to overhaul all your systems, member care, HR, IT, onboarding, and everything else to linguistically and culturally adapt to this new thing that may not be the most beneficial thing to everybody in your community.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, hello and welcome once again to the Mission Matters podcast. I am Matthew Ellison, and you know what I'm going to say. I am joined by my good friend and co-host, Ted Essler. Ted, greetings, brother.
So today we are going to be talking to Dave Matthews, whom I would describe as an entrepreneurial young leader in the missions community. And we're going to start with a little background that he's going to share, but let me just say that I relate to a lot of different ministry leaders, and I was really excited. I met Dave for the first time at the Missio Nexus annual event this last year, and I knew right away that his voice is the one that we really need to amplify in the missions community. So Dave, could you just give us a little introduction to who you are and just a few sentences on your background?
Yeah, totally. Thank you, Ted and Matthew, for having me here. So I'm Dave. I'm originally from Peru, born and raised in Lima. And when I was a teenager, my family moved to the U.S. While I was in the U.S., I went to a youth camp done by our denomination. And that was the first time I heard about the unreached. That moment God touched me and said, you need to be a missionary. And my first question to that call was, what is a missionary? My background had no context, no idea, nothing as to what that was. And it's been a journey of unfolding that over time. Since then, my wife and I met at Moody Bible Institute. Shortly after college, we got married, and we've gotten into missions, mobilization, and sending in Latin America through Reflejo.
So what's your current role?
So I'm the founder and president of Reflejo. We are a Latin American sending agency made by Latinos for Latinos, going to some of the tougher places among them.
Awesome.
So Dave, I'm going to ask the why question. Why should we focus on mobilizing and sending Hispanics to the unreached peoples of the world?
Oh, how much time do you have? I mean, if you ask me as a Latino or as a Hispanic, why should we go? The simple answer is because we're called to. You know, the Great Commission applies to me, applies to my people, applies to our continent. And so we have a duty to obey God, and we have the privilege to co-labor with them in reaching the unreached. But pragmatically, I think there's many other things that make Latinos uniquely equipped to play their role in the Great Commission work. One thing I would say is that we have historical, cultural commonalities. So centuries ago, the Moors from Northern Africa went and really resided for a very long season in what was Hispania, which is now Spain and Portugal. And they were there for 781 years before the Crusades pushed them back out into Northern Africa. But that almost 8 centuries of influence affected how people thought in the region, their worldview, their perspective, their language, their architecture. And that's what the conquistadores then brought to Latin America. The Spaniards to all the Spanish-speaking countries and the Portuguese to Brazil. And so as we look at our worldview, at our way of thinking, and the way we approach things, we're very, very similar to anybody that's been affected by the Arab or the Muslim world in general. That's where we are unashamed, and they're unashamed. And so there's a lot of things there that just allow us to go deeper, faster when it comes to cultural connection.
So you're involved in mobilization of Hispanics and or Latinos. What are the differences between what you're doing and, say, from the Anglo world when we do mobilization and recruitment?
Yeah, let me actually go ahead and for a second jump into those two terms first, because I personally use them a little bit differently.
I was going to ask.
No, that's great. And I don't know if this is something universal, but at least in the mission circles in Latin America I've participated in, this is a very common use of those words. So when we say Hispanics, we traditionally mean Latin Americans living abroad. So like in the U.S., for example. Hispanic diaspora in the States, in Canada, beyond. When we talk about Latinos, we're talking about Latin Americans living as the majority people group in their respective countries, Peruvians in Peru, Colombians in Colombia, and so on. And so these two groups behave very differently and have very different needs as well when it comes to mission sending. We do work with both, but probably what we do the most of is working with Latinos in Central and South America to be sent to the unreached. So your question was, how is it different? I mean, I think one of the most obvious differences that we can look at right away is language. Whether it's just the application form for somebody to fill out, I want to join your organization, or then my pastor may not speak English and he needs to fill out a reference, or things like that. There's some things around systems that just need to be adapted linguistically. Member care is another big thing. If my heart language is Spanish or if my heart language is Portuguese and the entirety of your member care team is English speaking, the care I'm getting is probably not going to connect directly with me. And that's not only applies to the missionary, that can apply to the sending partners. If I'm going to a difficult place and my church is putting trust in an organization, but my family is putting trust in an organization to send me there, they probably want an intimate relationship with that organization. And for them to be able to talk and sit down with somebody that understands their language, that understands their cultures, their financial constraints, geopolitical reality, that can sit down with the parents, even during a crisis, and say, here is how we're working to care and love on your son, daughter, grandchildren, and so on. That's important. And we can't discount that. Beyond language, culture is another very, very big component. Latin American culture and Hispanic culture, they're less individualistic. So oftentimes the family of the missionary or the pastor or even the broader church play a much more prominent role in discerning a calling, in sending, and even as they go to the field. And so that could be very shocking to the process, the systems, the expectations of the deputized missionary from the U.S. that they apply, there's some references, they're accepted, and then they go back to their church to say, hey, now me and agency X are going to be working towards this. Will you financially support me? It seems to be a much more involved conversation within the Latin American and the Hispanic community. Some of the challenges could be different as well. Support raising is a difficult challenge in Latin America, especially in countries that are politically or financially unstable right now. Picture the reality of Venezuela, of Cuba, the recent inflation happening in Argentina over the past year. These are things that somebody that's familiar, an organization that's familiar with this context can understand. And even if a Western org understands all this, it's hard for somebody from a Western background to say, let me see what here needs to be culturally adapted. And let me also look at where you're using these excuses as a crutch. And let me call you on that with authority. Me as a Latino, I can call somebody else out as a Latino and say, look, you're just saying it's easier in the US to make an excuse to not fundraise. You and I know what the reality is here. And I can confront them with that. So there's a different component to all those things. Security is another big one that we deal with, right? Most of my training in the US for going to a close country, it's if you get in trouble, call the US embassy. Well, what happens if you're a Bolivian national? What happens if you were sent from a Dominican Republic? Who do you call? And that's assuming you get there. How do you even get there if there is no Pakistani embassy in Colombia? What do you do? Where do you go? How do you find that out? There's a whole new set of things that we need to look into, to research, to connect, to really walk alongside of Latinos or Hispanics as they have unique needs going to the field.
So, Dave, can the mobilization and sending of Hispanics and Latinos be achieved through traditional Western missions organizations?
I would say to a degree. It's like asking, can somebody that is a native person from another country show up to your church on a Sunday for an English service and be ministered to? Yes, but maybe not to the depth that they would in an indigenous setting. I think back to my experience living in the US for many years. And because of school, I had to learn English right away. But oftentimes I've taken my parents to different churches where the service is in English. And there's this wonderful thing that you guys are very familiar with, where they give you a little box and headphones, and you hear the translation. And you'll hear the sermon, probably not the worship being translated or sung by a translator, and you'll get a sense of connection as their systems adapt to your needs in language. It feels something autochthonous, native to the people group that is being served by this organization. I think we'll be able to go so much deeper. It's really hard to ask a big international organization that for decades has been having as their primary missionary base a specific culture, a specific language, to say, well, suddenly now we have a very small representation of another ethnic group, and now you need to overhaul all your systems, member care, HR, IT, onboarding, and everything else to linguistically and culturally adapt to this new thing that may not be the most beneficial thing to everybody in your community. Just like if I showed up at your church on Sunday, you wouldn't change the sermon to be in Spanish for everybody. I think we need to actually look at what are different services, maybe under the same community umbrella, maybe as sister churches, maybe as sister sending agencies. What would that collaboration look like?
Yeah, and I would just add, so I visited some teams that were sent from Peru, Argentina, that were working in a very restricted access country in North Africa. And none of them had any English language skills at all, which should not be an expectation. But most of the large internationalized organizations, they're assuming at least one language that works for everybody. And like it or not, that happens to be English. And so by having that as kind of an unspoken rule or requirement, we're actually cutting off a lot of people that could otherwise participate. I think another reality, too, that's going on, we don't have time to get into this too deeply, but we are entering the era which some are calling the end of globalization. And in light of fading globalization, I do think one of the expressions we're going to see in the church, I personally think is healthy, are churches that are more indigenously engaging in mission than kind of shooting for this globalized sort of structure, which is seeking to incorporate everybody into it. So I do think that's another thing that's going on right now, kind of across the board on the global stage.
So Dave, what's it going to take for Latinos and Hispanics to thrive on the field? You talked about the unique challenges that are represented by that. So what does it take for them to thrive on the mission field?
Well, I mean, the first thing comes to mind as you were asking that question is it's God. I think God is so big and so wonderful. And I don't want to discount the work of many pioneers from Latin America that have gone with, some luggage and faith and the Holy Spirit and have done amazing work. And we are standing on their shoulders. But I think that as new organizations like Reflejo, like others that are emerging at this point from Latin America, create the infrastructure and are set up to grow to the point that more missions candidates that have a calling, have a yearning to go to the unreached, they need to figure many things out, feel like they can be surrounded by a community of people that says, you don't only belong here, but we can look at walking alongside with you, with your church, with your community to discover what does it mean to be a Colombian missionary family in Pakistan? What does it look like to be an Argentinian team in Uzbekistan? We're figuring that out right now. And I think we're not the only ones. There's an emerging global or continental movement from Latin America saying, God has called us. He's showing us the path, but it really does need to be our own.
Yeah, I know part of that has been the development of Reflejo. Could you tell us a little bit about the organization?
Yes. So our organization started personally, as my wife and I started the organization as founders, really started out of our personal frustration. We thought God was calling us to go to Afghanistan and we were going to move there. And we tried. We tried a few times and God slammed the door right in our faces a couple times in very dramatic ways. And we won't get into that now. But what that showed us, among many things that we learned, was Latinos do have a really hard time going occasionally. And even people like she's from the U.S., I'm a U.S. citizen. Even if you're from the U.S., there's places that are just hard to reach anyway. And so when you combine those things, there is a big challenge. We ended up hearing from God, if you can't go, send, help others go. So the first thing we did was we just went to Latin church to pray for Afghanistan. And we thought when the church hears about the need there, they will respond in obedience. And that they did. That led to a massive prayer movement that's still going on for the unreached in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Tajikistan, throughout 17 Latin American countries. And through that prayer, God started raising people that said, I have a heart to go. How can I go? How can I be sent? Who will send me? And really, Reflejo was born out of those people approaching us, God saying, here are the people that I'm raising up to go. Let's not leave them halfway. Let's prepare an organization, an entity where they feel they belong, because the callings that they have, the places they're willing to go to, the counting of the cost they've done is too precious for me for that to just be lost because there was no connection point. And so Reflejo wants to be that space. We want to be the agency that when somebody says, I want to go to the difficult places, I'm willing to lay down my life, if need be, and put everything before the cross to go so that Pashtuns, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks can hear about Jesus. Jesus already gave his life for them. We can say, well, let us come alongside of you and support and bless what God is doing through you, through your family, through your community.
I love that you mentioned frustration, that the vision was born out of frustration. Isn't that so often the case? There's a frustration with status quo, whatever, and God moves. So really appreciate that. One of the challenges in mobilizing churches in the United States is just there's a lack of sound biblical missiology. This redemptive story of God from Genesis to Revelation, which is the meta narrative of the Bible. It's the mega theme of Scripture. It is in the margins in so many churches. It's forgotten, if not, completely obscured, whatever you want to say. What's the state of missions awareness in Latino and Hispanic churches?
Yeah, there's a very wide range. It varies between countries, regions, denominational backgrounds. There's different components to it. I would say that the people that are very highly missionally aware and involved already from Latin America are few. I mean, Latin Americans sending missionaries isn't new. It's been happening for at least 4 decades, but it's not the critical mass of the majority of people that are aware of this. What I would say is we as Latinos are more and more understanding that, just like missions came to us and we were reached by missionaries coming to our country, cities and villages and beyond, we have all the tools at our disposal now. We have the biblical translation, we have the churches, we have the spiritual maturity, we have the training, we have the technology. Latin America even has financial resources that we can be a part of the solution. There is no excuse now. And so more and more, we're being confronted with that. I think just like in the U.S., the verse that comes to mind when Peter tells the church that God is being patient with us for the sake of the unreached, so that none will perish. It's not that he's being patient with them to change their mind. He's being patient with us to decide to go. And I think that's what's happening in Latin America as well. But people are beginning to respond in willingness, I would say, in a much more drastic way than I'm seeing it in the U.S. in this season.
One other thing they have that I think is missing in the Western church is they have a fairly near recent memory of not being reached. In other words, you go back just a couple generations and you find people that, they didn't know Christ, they didn't have churches, etc. And because it's more recent in South and Central America, there's the memory of need, and that is very motivating for people to engage in mission themselves.
Another component related to that, Ted, that I think is very interesting, it's in Latin America, compared to the U.S., it's easier to say in God we trust, because it's harder to trust in many contexts, in government, in financial wealth, in political stability. we know what hardship and uncertainty is, and the way that I oftentimes say it, it's easier to pray for your daily bread with an empty pantry. And so I think Latinos, there's less things, like the rich man that approached Jesus that said you need to give everything away. There's less things that at times we need to give away to be fully committed. And I think God uses that too in just nudging us out the door to the nations.
Yeah, that's so good, Dave. So how can the Western Church, how can we come alongside these organizations like yours that are mobilizing Latinos and Hispanics? How do we join forces?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that come to mind. And I love this question because I picture, the body of Christ. And oftentimes we think of that in the context of the local church. I think we need to think of that in the context of the global church and each region of the church. Think North American, Latin American, South African, East Asian, and beyond, have different components and strengths to offer. The first thing I would say is what's happening right now. And again, I'll thank you guys for inviting me here. It's awareness. If we don't know of these other groups, organizations, opportunities, global sending that's happening, we're not even going to start asking the right questions. And so I think starting this conversation, making it more mainstream, beginning to have these dialogues cross-culturally is something that needs to happen more and more. The second thing I would say is prayer. Organization started, as I shared, through a prayer movement that led to God opening every other door in ways that we can't take credit for, because we'll pray for something and the next day, the exact thing that we asked for, God showed up in a miraculous way. And that's a common occurrence when we are soaked in prayer. So we'll ask you and anybody listening out there, pray with us, pray for more organizations like ours to thrive around the globe for global sending. I also think there's some mutuality or symbiotic potential to coaching and collaboration. The Western churches have a much longer history of missional sending. There's hundreds of years of wealth of experience of written resources and biographies and systems and context that has been developed that we can learn from. I would say with Ted, even in the last year, we've been talking back and forth. I've learned a lot from you. And I think many in Latin America, we need to learn that way.
Well, I'm learning from you too, brother. Trust me on that.
Thank you. And that's the other part I would say. It's Latinos and other groups like Latinos around the world. We're going to try to do things differently. Our worldview is differently. It's different. And so there's innovation that's going to happen through this collaboration, through this community of connecting as well. So I would say awareness, prayer, this collaborative learning from each other. And the last thing I would say is giving. I forget where I heard this a while back, but I heard that 80% of the world's Christian wealth was in the Western world. And 80% of the world's Christians are in the global South. Really, if we put it in different terms, that means in Latin America, we have the candidates. And in the Western world, you guys have a lot of funding. What an incredible way God is setting up the global landscape to really put us into how do we become interdependent and collaborate across cultures. That is such a mighty testimony to the unreached.
Love it so much. Yeah, I get excited about the potential, and I think that even that last piece about the need for global giving. Just so much information needs to get out about opportunities to give, and boy, it gets me excited to think about the possibilities there. Huge numbers of people that want to go, but they're not able to acquire adequate funding. That's the sadness of our day, unfortunately. Well, tell us, how could somebody sitting on this, listening to this podcast, how could they find out more about Reflejo?
Well, I would say the easiest way is go to our website, reflejo.org, reflejo.org. And it is in English, it's in Spanish, it's in Portuguese. Just for that sake, we want to collaborate with different language groups as well. If anybody emails or reaches out to the Mission Matters podcast, I'll be glad to connect with them if you guys connect us as well.
Fantastic. Well, our guest today was Dave Matthews, founder of Reflejo, and I just want to really thank you, Dave, and love your heart, love your ministry.
Thank you guys for having me. This has been wonderful.
Bless you, brother.
Before you go, Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Essler, president of Missio Nexus.